The sheriff sent word the morning of the hanging. A Lakota chief had already cut the rope down. The rope was still swinging when I rode through the gate. Not swinging hard, just that slow turn a thing does when the weight's been taken off sudden, a lazy circle like it hadn't made up its mind yet what to do with itself. The crossbar was pine, 2 notches cut in it from older use. I noticed that. My eyes go to those things, 2 notches. Somebody had stood under this before and lived, or somebody had stood under it and hadn't. Either way, the wood remembered. I had my knife in my hand. I don't know that I decided to do it before I got there. That's the truth of it, strange as it sounds. I was 3 miles out when the rider caught me, one of my own, a young man named Talks Fast, which was a name he'd earned and deserved, and he said the word in a way that made me know I had maybe 20 minutes. I pushed the horse, and somewhere between the ridge and the south fence of Callaway's holding, with the dust coming up behind me and the sun not yet past the courthouse roof, I'd already made the decision without knowing I'd made it. The knife was in my hand when I cleared the gate. The woman was on the ground. 2 of the sheriff's men were standing back from her like she was a fire that might still catch. She had her hands tied behind her and her knees in the dirt, and she was coughing, that cough that comes from a rope that caught and then didn't, a sound like something wet and broken working to get clear. Her hair had come loose. She had gray in it, dark gray against black, and it hung across her face so I couldn't see her yet. The sheriff was there. Holt Deering, a man I'd known going on 11 years, a man I'd eaten with and disagreed with and occasionally respected and never fully trusted, which put him in about the same category as most men I'd known in that time. He looked at me the way men look when they're calculating whether what just happened is going to cost them more than the thing they were doing. His deputy, young man, red-faced, a rifle that looked too big for him had already half-raised the barrel. I looked at him, just looked. He lowered it. I got down off the horse. Deering said, "That was a legal hanging, Standing Rock." "My name is not Standing Rock. My name is Sungilamato, Bear That Runs, and I have answered to various names in my 51 years, some given by my people, some by the whites on the other side of whatever line they'd drawn most recently, some by men who meant them as insults, and some by men who meant them fine. Standing Rock was a mistake the land office made 16 years ago when they wrote down what they thought they heard. I'd stopped correcting it with Deering around year 3. "Some men you stop correcting." I said, "Show me the paper." He said, "I don't answer to you." "Then we're wasting time. Show me the paper or don't. I'm going to untie her either way." He looked at me for a long moment. The deputy was watching Deering like a dog watching its owner near a stranger, waiting to see what it was allowed to do. There were a few others around, 2 men on horses at the far fence who I thought I recognized as having business with Rafe Callaway, and an old Mexican man who seemed to be there by accident and was edging carefully toward the gate. Deering said, "She killed a man." I said, "I know what she's accused of." He said, "Accused, she was tried." I said, "In whose court?" He didn't answer that. He didn't answer it because the answer was Callaway's parlor with Callaway's men in the chairs, and we both knew it, and that knowledge sat between us in the morning air like something that had been dead a while. I walked to her and crouched down and cut the rope at her wrists. She flinched when the knife touched the cord, a small, tight flinch, not fear exactly, more like a body that had been bracing so long it couldn't tell the difference anymore between a threat and a hand. I kept the blade low and slow. The cord fell and I put the knife away. She sat back on her heels, got her hands in front of her. I could see her wrists were dark where the rope had been. She was looking at the ground. I said in English, "Can you stand?" She said after a moment, "Yes." I gave her my hand. She took it without looking at my face yet, and I pulled her up and she stood, and she was taller than I'd thought from seeing her on her knees. She was maybe 40, maybe a few years past. A hard-weather face, not ugly, not soft, a face that had been used and had held up to it. She got her breathing right, stood straight. Then she looked at me. She said, "You're the one they call Standing Rock." I said, the land office calls me that. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. She said, then I'll call you something else when I learn it. Deering said, she rides away from here, and you're telling every man in 3 counties that the word of a territorial court means nothing. You understand that? I turned to face him. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because a man can tell a story wrong by leaving out the part where he was afraid. I was not afraid of Deering, and I was not afraid of the deputy, and I was not afraid of the 2 men at the fence. I was afraid of what comes after. I had lived 51 years on land that kept changing its name underneath me, served 2 wars that had nothing to do with my people, sat in more rooms with more white men who had more paper than sense, and I knew that the thing you cut down doesn't always stay down. I knew that what I'd just done was going to cost something, and I didn't yet know the full price. I said, what I'm telling every man in 3 counties is that a rope needs a proper verdict behind it. You want to argue that, write to the territorial judge. He knows my name. He did know my name. That was the only card I had in that hand, and I'd played it flat on the table. Deering knew it too. He chewed on his back teeth for a moment. He said, this isn't finished. I said, no, I don't imagine it is. He rode out. The deputy followed. The men at the fence went slower, watching over their shoulders, but they went. The old Mexican man had already been gone for some time. I looked at her. She was pressing one hand against her throat where the rope had been, not hard, just holding it the way you hold a thing that hurts. She said, what do I do now? It wasn't really a question. It was the kind of thing a person says when they've just come to the edge of what they'd been holding themselves together for, and suddenly, there's nothing left to hold against. I said, right now you come with me. Her name was Corestell. She'd come west from Missouri 11 years back with a husband named George who died of a fever 3 winters in, and she'd stayed because there wasn't much to go back to and because she'd found work as a cook at the Harmon Station relay point, where the stage lines crossed out near the Canyon Road. She was good at it. She was good at other things too. She could doctor a horse, and she knew which plants in that country would help a wound close, and she had a way of reading weather off the sky that was better than any almanac I'd seen. She told me these things over 3 days, not all at once. The way a person talks when they've been silent a long time and the words come out in pieces, a few at a time, like they're checking whether it's safe. The man she was accused of killing was named Finch, Tom Finch. He worked for Callaway, which was the kind of detail you had to understand about that whole country. Almost everything bad that happened in the valley in those years had Callaway somewhere in the roots of it, not always visible, but there. Finch had come to the station 3 months back, when Cora was working the kitchen alone. She'd told the judge, Callaway's man, what had happened. The judge had found her version of events unconvincing. He'd used that word, unconvincing. She told me this on the 2nd evening, sitting outside the fires reached the way a person does when they're not sure yet how close they're allowed to get. I was cleaning one of the saddle buckles, which was work that didn't need doing right then but gave my hand something while she talked. She said the word unconvincing, and then she was quiet for a while, and then she said, he wrote it down, on the paper. Unconvincing. I kept thinking about that word. I said, what did you think about it? She said that I'd stood in that kitchen and I knew what I knew, and he sat in that chair with his pen and he wrote down that what I knew was unconvincing, and he'd never been in that kitchen. He'd never been in any kitchen. He wrote it down anyway. I didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say to that. I knew that particular experience, the experience of knowing a thing with your whole body, and then watching a man with a pen decide it wasn't so, and I'd learned that the wrong kind of words in response to it are worse than silence. She looked at me after a while and said, you don't talk much. I said, I talk when something needs saying. She said, George used to say that too, but with him it mostly meant he'd run out of things to say. I said, I haven't run out. She looked at the fire, said, no, I don't think you have. There was a third night before we reached my camp, and on that night she asked me about the two wars. She asked it straight. She'd heard something from men at the settlement, some version of the story, and she wanted to know what was true. I didn't usually talk about that either, the wars, but there was something in the way she asked that wasn't about collecting a story. She asked like a person who wants to understand the weight a man is carrying, not the details. I said I'd ridden with the cavalry the first time because there'd been a treaty promise attached to it, a land guarantee that had been half-honored for 4 years, and then not at all. The second time I'd gone because 3 of my young men were going to go anyway, and they were better off with me along than without. She listened all the way through. She didn't say it was a shame, or that it wasn't fair, or any of the things people say when they want to show they feel something about a thing they weren't part of. She said, "You spent a long time doing things for other people's reasons." I said my own reasons too. Sometimes the two lines up. She said, "And when they don't?" I said, "Then you do the thing that costs you less long term." She looked at me, said, "That's a hard way to live." I said, "It's a way to keep living." She didn't have an argument for that. She put more wood on the fire and we were quiet for a long time, and it was the kind of quiet that isn't uncomfortable, just two people in the same space letting the night do what it does. My camp was not far from the main winter ground of my band, 3 days' ride north, but I hadn't been back there in 6 weeks. I'd been in the valley doing what I'd been doing for going on 4 years, which was the necessary, exhausting, occasionally humiliating work of existing in 2 places at once. My people needed certain things from the white world: treaty guarantees, land boundaries, access to the creek that the cattle operations kept pushing them off of, and getting those things meant being present in the white world, in its offices and its courtrooms and its negotiating rooms, in a way that cost something every time. I did it because someone had to, and because I was the one who had learned enough of how their world worked to do it without being completely destroyed by it. That was the truth of my life in those years. I carried 2 things at once, like a man carrying water in both hands across broken ground. You spill from one side and then the other. You learn to walk slow. Cora stayed in camp. She helped. She didn't ask if she could. She simply began doing things that needed doing, which I appreciated. She had no capacity for being idle. I watched her those first days, cataloging her the way you catalog anything that's entered your territory, not hostile, just attentive. She moved with economy, no wasted motion. She had a cook's hands, strong through the wrist, and she used them like tools. She didn't flinch at the work of the camp, and she didn't perform not flinching, which was its own thing that some people did around me and my men, a kind of exaggerated ease that was its own kind of condescension. She just worked. My second in those years was a man named Crow Looks Back, who was older than me and considerably more suspicious of everyone, which he'd earned and which made him useful. He watched Cora for 2 days and then came to me and said, in Lakota, "She's not afraid of anything." I said, "She's afraid of some things." He said, "Not here, not of us." I said, "No, not of us." He thought about this. Then he said, "That's either stupid or she sees something." I said, "I think she sees something." He made a sound that wasn't agreement and wasn't refusal, and went back to what he was doing. What Crow Looks Back was responding to, I think, though he would never have put it this way, was that Cora treated the camp the same way she treated a kitchen. She looked at what was in front of her and figured out what it needed and did it. There wasn't a layer of opinion over the top of the seeing. On the 4th day she asked one of the younger women, whose name was Small River, if she would show her how the pemmican was dried in that method, because she'd seen a different method, and she wanted to understand the difference. She asked with her hands as much as her words. She spoke no Lakota then, and Small River showed her, and she watched with the full attention of a person actually learning something, not a person being polite. I saw that from across the camp, and I thought, this one pays attention. Whatever else she is, she pays attention. And a person who pays attention is a person you can trust in the field, because they see what's actually there instead of what they expected. The territorial judge's name was Aldous Cray, and he came through that country every 6 weeks on a schedule you could more or less count on if you knew which road he favored, and what time of year the other road turned to mud. I'd sent word ahead, one of my men riding 3 days to reach the relay post, and Cray met me at the stage station north of Deeringstown on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the color of pewter, and there was snow in the air that hadn't decided to fall yet. He was a fair man, not a warm man, not the kind of man you'd want company with over a long winter, and his sense of humor was the dry kind that mostly came out as a look, but fair. He dealt straight with me 3 separate times over the preceding 4 years, and he knew what Calloway was, even if knowing it and being able to act on it were 2 different things. He read the papers I brought. He asked Cora 3 questions, short and direct, and she answered them the same way. He asked about Finch. He asked about the kitchen. He asked about the judge. Then he sat with it for a moment. He said, "The verdict stands." Cora's jaw went tight. I felt something go hard in my chest. He said, "As issued, it stands. But a territorial court supersedes it immediately and completely. I'm entering a nolle prosequi on the charge. She's free and the matter is closed." Cora said, "What does that mean?" Cray said, "It means in the eyes of the territory, nothing happened. No conviction, no hanging, no debt. You're a free woman, and if Deering or anyone connected with Calloway bothers you again in relation to this matter, you bring word to me." He folded the papers and put them in his coat. He looked at me and said, "I'm going to write a letter to the federal office about that parlor court. I've been meaning to do it." I said I'd appreciate that. He said, "I imagine you would." He put his hat on, Standing Rock. I said, "Judge." He rode. Cora stood beside me in the cold outside the station. The snow had started, light and indifferent, the kind that lands and vanishes without proving anything. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Is it enough?" I said, "For Calloway, no, for the law, yes, the difference matters." She said, "How much does it matter?" I said, "Enough that if he moves against you, there's a paper behind you. Papers matter in this world, even when they shouldn't be what matters." She looked at me. She said, "Is that why you do it? All the going back and forth, the rooms and the papers?" I said, "My people need what the papers say." "So yes." She said, "And you carry that?" I said, "Someone does." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Is it heavy?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I said, "Some days." She nodded, like that was the only answer that made sense, and I believed she understood it, not in the way of sympathy but in the way of a person who has also carried something heavy for a long time and knows what the weight does to your shoulders. She said after a moment, "The judge knew my name when he called me in. He didn't look at the paper first. He already knew it." I said, "I sent word ahead." She said, "What did your word say?" I said that a woman was wrongly condemned, that she had not had a proper hearing, that I was bringing her and the facts. She said, "And he came?" I said he was already on his circuit. It was 2 days out of his way. She looked at me, said, "But he came." I said, "Yes." She turned that over quietly. Then she said, "You have more standing in this world than people know." I said, "I've worked for it. It cost a great deal." She said, "I know it did," just that. She'd heard the 3-day ride story, the war stories, the room stories. She knew what it had cost. She wasn't performing knowledge of it, she just had it. "I know it did," and then she stood there beside me in the cold snow that wasn't landing, and she didn't fill the silence with anything. I didn't ask her to stay. That needs saying, because I know how a story can be told wrong by leaving that part out. I didn't ask her. I wasn't looking for anyone. I had been alone in the way that men who carry a great deal of weight often end up alone, not from want of company, but because the weight becomes its own kind of presence, filling the space where another person might go. My wife had died 8 years before. Her name was Blue Sky Morning, and I don't talk about her much because she isn't part of this story, and because the grief of her is still there, not sharp anymore but real, the way an old break in a bone is still there when the weather changes. We had no children that lived past their first winter. That was a sorrow I'd put in a particular place and left there, because there was no use taking it out and examining it. I'd learned to live around it the way you learn to walk with one knee that doesn't bend right. So I wasn't looking for anyone. I want that to be plain. What happened was this. After the thing with Judge Cray, there was still the matter of where Cora would go. The station job was gone. Calloway's men had told the relay company some version of the story that had gotten her dismissed. She had a little money, not much. She had no family within 200 miles. She had her horse, which was a sound animal, a grulla mare she'd clearly taken care of. We rode back toward my camp, without much discussion of what happened next. 3 days' ride, cold weather, the snow coming harder the second day. We camped on the second night in a cut of rock that kept the wind off. I had the fire built well and she managed the food, which she did better than I did, and we both knew it and neither of us commented on it. We ate and she washed out the pan with snow and then sat back against the rock with her blanket and said, looking at the fire, "I'd be dead without you." I said, "The rope didn't take, you might have got free." She said, "You know that's not true." I did know it. The rope had taken. It had held for a moment before I got there. There was bruising on her throat that told the story, and in another 10 seconds she'd have been gone. I said, "Yes." She said, "I don't know how to repay that." I said, "I didn't do it for repayment." She said, "I know that, that's what makes it harder to sit with." She looked at me. "Why did you?" This was a question I'd thought about in the night since. Not with discomfort, more like you think about anything real, turning it over, checking what it actually is. I said, "There was no verdict worth honoring. They'd taken a woman to hang without cause, and I was 3 miles away with a knife and enough standing that Deering would hesitate. So I went." She said, "Just like that?" I said, "Not just like that. I knew what it would cost." "And you went anyway?" I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. Snow came off a branch somewhere above us, a soft fall. She said, "What's your real name?" I told her, Sungila Mato. She said it back slowly, getting the sounds right, trying them with care. She said, "What does it mean?" I said, "Bear that runs." She thought about this, said, "Do bears run?" I said, "When they have to." She looked at me then in a way that people rarely do, not at my face exactly but at what was behind it, the way you look when you're trying to see whether a person is what they appear to be. Not suspicious. Just honest. The firelight was doing what firelight does, and she had snow in her hair from when it had come down off the branch, and she was 40 years old or so, and she had survived a rope that morning, and she looked in that moment like a woman who had decided something. I didn't know yet what she'd decided. She said, "I'm going to call you that." I said, "All right." She stayed. Not at the camp, not immediately. She found work at a ranch 2 days north of my winter ground, cooking for a family named Aberfelt who were decent people, and who asked her no questions about the bruising at her throat, which was also decent. She took a room in the barn they'd converted, small and cold but private. She paid her way, and she was careful with money the way a person is when they've had to be. I rode past the Aberfelt place on my way north and south for the rest of that winter. She was always outside when I came through. I noticed, even in cold that drove most people indoors. Working the kitchen garden that had nothing in it yet, or walking the horse, or splitting wood she didn't need to split because the Aberfelt sons did that. I began stopping. First time was a minute, maybe 2. I took a cup of coffee she offered and said thank you and went on. Then it was longer. There was one afternoon in February when I arrived in a hard sleet, the kind that comes sideways and finds every gap in your coat. I was on my way back from the settlement where I'd spent 3 days arguing about the creek boundary with a land agent who had the patience of a man who knew he held the paper. I was tired in the way that isn't physical. She was in the barn when I came through, doing something with the mare's left rear shoe. She'd found a loose nail and was handling it with a pair of Aberfelt's pliers, making do. She looked up when she heard me, looked at my face, didn't say anything for a moment. She said, "Come in out of the sleet." I did. She put the mare's hoof down and wiped her hands on her work trousers, and she brought me into the barn where it was dry, and she found a blanket, not hers, one of the Aberfelt's horse blankets, clean enough, and she handed it to me and went to the small brazier they kept in there for the horses and added to it. She didn't ask what had happened at the settlement. She didn't need me to perform being all right. She just put the blanket in my hands and made the room warmer and moved around me with a kind of steady ease. And after a while, I felt the cold going out of my shoulders, and I sat on a hay bale, and she sat across from me on a crate, and she said, "Tell me if you want to talk." I said after a while, "Not tonight." She said, "All right." And that was all. We sat in the warm barn with the sleet outside, and after a time she made coffee on the brazier and we drank it, and she told me about the mare's shoe and about something one of the Aberfelt sons had done that morning that was both stupid and funny, and I listened, and by the time I left the tiredness had changed character. It was still there, but it had shifted from the suffocating kind to the ordinary kind, the kind you can sleep through. I rode home in the sleet and I thought, that woman knows how to be with a person. Crow looks back noticed. Men who have ridden with you for years notice everything and say nothing until they do, and when they do, they don't hedge it. He came to me one morning in late February and said, "You keep riding past the white woman's place." I said, "It's on the way." He said, "It's half a mile off the way and you know it." I said, "Maybe." He looked at me for a long time. He said, "In Lakota, she's not afraid of you." I said, "You mentioned that." He said, "I'm saying it again because it matters. Most of them are. Even the ones who are friendly, there's something in them." "She doesn't have it." I said, "No." He said, "Why not?" I thought about it. I said, "She's seen enough of the world to know that the things that hurt you are rarely the things you expected." He said, which was his version of agreement. In March she sent word with the Aberfelt's youngest boy, 10 years old, proud to have been trusted with a message, that there was trouble. Calloway's foreman had come by the ranch, not threatening, just visible, standing outside the fence looking at the house for a while and then riding on. The Aberfelts were not Calloway people, but they weren't going to put themselves in front of a man like that for a cook, and everyone understood this without it being said. I rode to the Aberfelt place that evening. She was sitting on the bench outside the converted barn. She had her hands around a cup that wasn't steaming anymore, which meant she'd been sitting there a while. She looked up when I came through the gate, and something went out of her face, not relief exactly, more like the settling of a thing that had been held up under tension. I got down and tied the horse and sat on the bench beside her. She said, "You got my message?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I don't want to be afraid of him." I said, "You don't have to be, not while I'm here." She looked at me, said, "How long can you be here?" I said, "Long enough." She said, "That's not an answer." I said, "It's the answer I can give right now. There are things I have to manage for my people." "You know that." She said, "I do know that." She looked at the cup in her hands, said, "I just want to know what this is." I said, "What do you think it is?" She said, "I'm asking you." This was a woman who did not play sideways at things. She asked straight and she waited for a straight answer. I had respected this about her from the start, and I respected it more then, sitting in the cold March evening with the last light going yellow-gray over the fence. I said, "I think it's more than I expected when I rode through that gate with a knife in my hand." She said, "More than saving a woman who needed saving." I said, "Yes." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Sungila Mato." I said yes. She said, "I'm not going anywhere." Something in me shifted that I hadn't known was braced. Like a post that's been under pressure so long you forgot it was under pressure, and then the pressure lifts. She reached out and put her hand over mine where it rested on my knee. Just covered it, held it. Her hand was calloused and warm from the cup, and she didn't look at me when she did it, just looked out at the fence and the darkening sky, easy and certain, like a woman who knows exactly where she stands and has decided. I turned my hand over and held hers. We sat there until the light was gone. Calloway moved in April. I'll tell it plainly. He had 2 men ride onto the Aberfelt property on a Thursday morning when I happened to be there, which was either his mistake or his way of testing what I would do. They were armed and they were not subtle. They told the Aberfelt sons that the cook was wanted for questioning in a matter that was still open. They used the word still. Like Cray's Noel Prosky hadn't happened. Like a man with enough horses and enough money could rewrite what was already written. The Aberfelt sons were young men and good ones, and they did what young men do when their household is threatened. They stood up, which would have gotten them hurt. I came around the side of the house. I don't make speeches at moments like that. I've learned that what carries the moment is not what you say, but what you carry behind your eyes. And what was behind my eyes was 4 years of patience running up against one clear line. There's a particular look a man gets when he has decided that the next wrong thing that happens will be the last one he tolerates. And I don't know if I'm able to describe it properly, except to say that both of Calloway's men saw it, and they recalculated. I said to them, "Judge Cray's order is on file in the territorial office. The copy I hold is signed and dated. If Rafe Calloway wants to test federal jurisdiction, I'll help him do that. If that's not what you're here for, ride out." They looked at each other. The older one had been around enough to know what I was, not just a man with a reputation, but a man with the kind of paper that could survive in court, which was a different and more dangerous thing than a man with a gun. Guns settled the moment. Paper settled what came after. They rode out. The older Aberfelt son, Pieter, a big fair-haired man of about 25, looked at me after they were gone and said, "That's twice you've done that." I said, "Done what?" He said, "Stood in front of something bad and just made it go." I said, "I had the right paper and enough reputation. 2 things most men don't carry at the same time." He said, "How do you carry them at the same time?" I said, "Long practice and considerable inconvenience." He laughed. Good honest laugh, the kind that comes from being scared and then not being scared. I liked him. Cora had come out of the barn when she heard voices. She was standing in the doorway. She'd seen the whole thing. When the Calloway men were well out the gate and down the road, she walked across the yard to where I was standing and stopped in front of me and looked up at my face. She said, "Are you all right?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You're sure?" I said, "I'm sure." She nodded like she was checking. Then she did something that surprised me. She put both hands flat on my chest, not grabbing, just resting them there, and she leaned her forehead against my chin, just for a moment. Something between a woman claiming what's hers and a woman saying thank you for something that words weren't right for. I put my hands on her back. Pieter Aberfelt made a quiet sound and found something urgent to do around the corner of the house. She straightened up and took a step back, looked at me steady. She said, "I'm still not going anywhere." I said, "I know." I said it and I meant it, and the truth of it sat between us in the April morning solid as something you could set your hand on. We didn't marry that month or the next. These things move at the pace they move. I had business in the north. The creek matter had come to a new crisis when a cattle operation had pushed 3 miles past the agreed line, and my people had moved south to avoid a confrontation that I needed to go settle, which took 5 weeks and a good deal of paper and 2 trips to the territorial office in the capital. and one extremely long conversation with a federal man named Tibbets who was not unintelligent, but who could not understand why a creek was a creek, and not a line on a map. I came home from that with less patience than I'd left with, and more respect for what paper could do when you knew how to wield it. Cora was at the Aberfelt place still. She'd become indispensable there in the way that women who are good at everything eventually become indispensable. She'd taken over the accounts as well as the kitchen, and Pieter's mother, who had bad eyes, now relied on her to read and write the household correspondence. She'd put down a kind of route. Not hers. She was clear she wasn't staying there forever, but a useful temporary route, the kind that holds the ground in place while you figure out the next thing. I came back through on my way south and stayed 3 days. We talked the way we'd been talking all spring, in long pieces and in short ones. In Lakota sometimes when I forgot, or when I wanted her to know, I'd tell her things in my own language, which she was learning, slowly, stubbornly, the way she did everything. She had a good ear, better than she let on. I caught her once responding to something Crow Looks Back said in Lakota when she thought I wasn't near just 3 words, a sentence, something correct. He'd looked at her with something approaching approval, which from Crow Looks Back was considerable. In June she came to the summer camp. Not permanently, she came with the Aberfelt family for a trade council I hosted that brought 4 families out from the settlement. She worked the food for it. She moved through the camp easy, learning where things were, talking to the women, my women, the camp's women, in the careful way of a person who knows they're a guest and means to honor that. My cousin's wife, Brings Rain, who was a woman with a very direct opinion about most things, watched Cora for 2 days and then told me that the white woman had more sense than 4 men I could name. I told her I didn't disagree. The night the trade council finished, when the Aberfelt wagons had gone and the camp was settling to its own rhythms, Cora sat with me by the fire, not saying much. The fire burned down slow. A dog barked somewhere far off and then didn't. The night sky out there was enormous, the way it is in summer when the air is clear and you feel small in the right way. She said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "All right." She said, "Do you want me to stay?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Not here in the camp." "I mean stay." I said, "I know what you mean." I looked at her. "Yes." She looked at me for a long time. That same look she'd had the first time, seeing behind the face, checking what was there. Then she said, "Then I will." Just that, no ceremony of words. She'd asked clean and I'd answered clean, and she'd decided. That was who she was. I said, "It won't be simple." She said, "Nothing worth having is." I said, "I mean specifically my life between 2 worlds, what that costs, the rooms and the papers, the things that don't resolve, my people's needs coming first." She said, "I understand that." I said, "You understand it now, at the easy part." She looked at me without flinching. She said, "Sungila motto, I stood under a rope in April. Easy isn't a condition I require." I looked at her. There was no argument to that. There was no argument in me. I said, "No, I suppose it isn't." We were together from that summer. I will not tell you it was without difficulty. A man who tells you his life with a good woman was without difficulty is telling you something was wrong in the life, or wrong in him. There were difficulties. The 2-world wait was real. I was away often, sometimes weeks, sometimes longer, and the absence was its own thing that she managed because she was built to manage things. But managing is not easy just because you're good at it. There were men on both sides of the line who had opinions. On the settler side, there were men who thought I had taken something that didn't belong to me, though of course the word they used was the other way around. And on my side, there were elders who thought she was a disruption, an outsider who would cost us at the moments when unity mattered. I heard both. I did not let either drive what I did, but I heard them. She settled 3 miles from the winter camp, on a piece of ground that was legal and registered and signed by Judge Cray's office, which I had arranged with considerable deliberateness. A small house. She built it, mostly. she and Pieter Aberfelt and his brother and 2 of my men who helped because Crow Looks Back told them to, and because they decided they liked her. She was the kind of woman who built things exactly straight and would go back and do a piece again if it wasn't. I watched her working on it in the early fall, the hammer in her hand, her hair tied back, and I thought, this woman is the kind that holds. Calloway himself came to me in October. Not with men, which surprised me. He rode alone, which was either a gesture of respect or a gamble, and with Calloway I never trusted the gesture, so I assumed the gamble. He sat on his horse outside my camp and asked for a word. I gave it to him. He was a big man, Rafe Calloway. Not heavy, big the way men are when they've worked hard all their lives, thick through the shoulders, a neck like something cut from wood. He had gray in his beard that hadn't been there a few years back, and he had the eyes of a man who had been looking at a horizon his whole life and had decided the horizon owed him something. He sat his horse well. I'll give him that. He said he wanted the matter with Cora Stell settled. He said his business interests in the valley required stability, and I was a destabilizing presence. I let him talk. There's a skill in letting a man talk past what he's comfortable saying. You stay quiet and attentive, and he fills the silence, and eventually he gets to the real thing, which is usually simpler than all the words around it. He said he wasn't a man who held grudges in a way that cost him money. He said there might be benefit in us reaching an arrangement. I said, what arrangement? He said, the creek, the line you want moved. I'll support it with the land office. I looked at him. He meant it. He had the kind of mind that was always calculating where the money ran, and somewhere in those months he'd calculated that fighting me was costing him more than the creek line was worth. He'd lost 2 men's services after the April business with the Aberfelts. Men who worked for him didn't want to be the ones who rode into my path again, and word of that spreads, and Judge Cray's letter to the federal office had put a new pair of eyes on his operations that he didn't want there. The creek was the important thing. The creek fed my people's winter ground. He knew it and I knew it, and he was telling me he'd give it to resolve everything else. I said, in Cora Stell. He said, free and clear, my business with her is finished. I said, your business with her was finished by Judge Cray 6 months ago. He said, call it confirmed. He held my eyes when he said it. Not comfortable, there was nothing comfortable in that conversation for either of us, but steady. The look of a man making a transaction he intends to honor because honoring it costs him less than not honoring it. I understood that look. It was business. It wasn't friendship and it wasn't contrition. It was arithmetic. The arithmetic said, settle it. I thought about it for a long moment. Not about whether to take the deal. I had the creek fight in motion and would probably win it in another 6 months without him. But 6 months was 6 months, and my people were moving south every winter to avoid the cattle. I thought about whether I trusted it. Whether a man who'd run a parlor court and put a woman under a rope was a man whose handshake meant anything. I decided his handshake meant nothing. His signature in front of Cray's office meant something. Paper meant something in this world even when the men behind it didn't. I said, put it in writing. Your signature and your land agents. Have it at the territorial office in 14 days. He said, done. He rode out, he didn't look back. Men like Calloway never look back because they've decided the looking back is weakness, which is one of the things that makes them dangerous and also one of the things that eventually undoes them. But he kept the deal. That's what matters. The paper came in 11 days. I had Cray look at it. Cray said it was solid. The creek line was in it, the line I'd fought for drawn right. And Cora Stell's name, free and clear, Calloway's signature under it in his hard old hand. I sat with that paper for a while after. There's a kind of tiredness that comes when a thing you fought a long time finally resolves. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated. The feeling of setting down a load and your arms still being in the shape of carrying it. Crow Looks Back came in and I showed him the paper. He read it, he read English well enough for documents, and then he was quiet. Then he said, The creek. I said yes. He said, and the woman. I said yes. He was quiet for another moment. He looked at the paper and then at me and then out the tent opening at the camp where things were moving in their ordinary rhythms. Then he said, "That was a good morning when you went through that gate." I said yes, it was. He went out. I folded the paper and put it in the case with the other papers, the ones that mattered, the ones that were holding things together with words and ink against the world's tendency to pull them apart. Then I rode 3 miles south and told Cora. She read it herself. I handed it to her and she read it through slowly, the way she read everything, taking it in, not rushing it. Then she said, "The creek line." I said yes. She said, "That's what you needed." I said, "That's what my people needed, yes." She folded the paper along its crease and handed it back. She said, "Then it's a good paper." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I think so." She said, "You look like a man who just set something down." I said, "Maybe." She put her hand on my face. Just for a moment, her palm against my jaw, checking, the way you check whether a person is running a fever. Then she dropped her hand and said, "Good. Come inside, I made something." She held. I want to say that again because it's the heart of it. She held through the hard winter, through my long absences, through the neighbor who rode 2 miles specifically to tell her she'd made a mistake, through the elder who came to me the first spring with a formal complaint about the disruption. She didn't make scenes about any of it, and she didn't pretend it wasn't there. She was built the way things are built when they intend to stand. The first winter together was the one I learned what it meant to come home. Not the house. The house was a fact. 4 walls and a roof and a door that fit right in its frame, because she'd planed it twice until it did. I mean the experience of coming in off the cold trail and knowing there was a person inside who was not waiting to need something from me or to present me with a problem that required solving. Just a person who wanted to know if the ride was hard and whether I'd eaten. That's smaller than it sounds. It's also larger. She had a particular way of listening, not performing it, not the nodding and the earnest eyes that people do when they want you to see that they're listening. She just went quiet and still, and her face was open and she took it in, whatever you said, the way good ground takes water. I noticed this the 3rd or 4th time I talked to her, and it never stopped being a thing I noticed. Some people listen to be ready with the next thing to say. She listened because she actually wanted to know. There were nights in that winter when the cold was bad enough that the house didn't fully beat it, when you could see your breath inside near the door. She didn't complain about it. She fixed things when she could, and when she couldn't she put more wool on and kept moving. One night in January, the wind came from the north, and the temperature dropped fast, and we sat up most of the night keeping the fire fed, because the cold was the kind that would get into the walls and freeze the water and there'd be damage in the morning. We took turns, 2 hours each, and when it was my turn I'd sit by the fire and listen to her breathing in the bed, that particular sound of someone sleeping deep and trusting, and I thought, there is something to be responsible for again. I hadn't had that in 8 years and I'd told myself I didn't miss it. Men lie to themselves about those things. Morning came gray and quiet and the cold broke by midday. She got up and made coffee and came out and looked at the yard. The water trough had a skin of ice on it 3 inches thick, and said, without distress, "Well, that's a morning's work." Then she went and got the axe. In the 2nd year, she learned the plant medicine from an old woman in my band named Sits in Mourning, which was a thing the old woman didn't share easily, and the fact that she shared it with Cora said something I didn't have a word for. She doctored 2 of my men that year, nothing mortal. A bad infection in one man's hand, a fever that needed watching in another. And she did it with the same calm she did everything, matter of fact and competent, asking Sits in Mourning where she needed asking, trusting her own hands where she knew they were right. Brings Rain said to me one afternoon, "She's useful." I said, "She is." She said, "I don't say that about most people." I said, "I know you don't." She looked at me with the expression she made when she was saying something beyond the words. She said, "She's good for you." I didn't answer that. I didn't need to. Brings Rain went back to her work and I went back to mine, and what she'd said stayed with me through the rest of the day, turning over, the way a true thing does when you've been carrying it without naming it and someone names it finally. She was good for me. The weight I carried was the same, it didn't go away, the world didn't become less complicated, the papers didn't stop needing to be fought for, and the rooms didn't stop costing something. But there was a difference between carrying a weight with no one who saw the carrying, and carrying it with a woman 3 miles from camp who knew what it was, and didn't ask you to be different, and had her lamp in the window when you came in late from the Capitol with the right paper finally in your saddlebag. I want to say one more thing, and then I'll leave the story where it is. There is something that a man can carry for so long that he forgets it's there. A particular weight, the weight of being looked at and not seen as what you are, seen as what the person looking at you needs you to be or fears you are or has decided before you opened your mouth. I had been under that weight so long, through so many rooms and so many negotiations and so many men with pens deciding what was and wasn't so, that I had stopped noticing it. You get used to weight. You adjust your stance. Cora looked at me. I mean that plain. She looked at me the way you look at a person you've decided to know, taking in what's actually there, not what's easier to see. She saw my competence, and she saw my patience, and she saw the cost of both. She saw the grief in me that I don't talk about, and she didn't make me talk about it. She saw that I was a man who had been carrying a great deal for a long time and had done it without breaking. And she looked at that and she said, not in words, but in the steady choosing of it every day, she said, "I see that. I see you. I'm here." That is not a small thing. The rope was still swinging when I came through that gate with a knife in my hand. I don't know exactly what I was going to do. I know what I did. I cut the rope. I helped her up. I gave her my hand. And she gave me back something I hadn't known I was missing. The lamp was in the window. I came in out of the cold. That's where the story ends.